Alleluia, Christ is risen. I saw an internet meme a couple of weeks ago when the stock market was doing its gyrations. It had two pictures of historical figures, author Charles Dickens and Dr. Erwin Schrödinger, he of paradoxical cat fame. Dickens said, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Schrödinger responds, "Nice, nice." Last week on Palm Sunday, we heard some words at the very end of our Passion reading that hardly get any notice given the powerful action that takes place before them. So here they are again for you. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. And then our lesson from Luke this morning continues with the very next verse. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. I've listened to and preached a lot of Holy Week and Easter sermons in my life. I've heard preachers say how those around Jesus deserted him, leaving him high and dry. How all those disciples couldn't take the heat, and that they spent Easter morning locked behind some doors, terrified about what might happen to them. Except, Luke reminds us, it wasn't all of them. Not all of the disciples fled in terror when the authorities came in to execute Jesus. The women, Luke says, the women stayed there at the cross, watching this one they loved as he breathed his last. They also followed Joseph of Arimathea when he took down Jesus' body, and they saw where that broken body was laid in a tomb. And then they went home to prepare spices and ointments for a proper burial. And then those women took their break, stopping their work at sundown on Friday in order to adhere to the commandment for Sabbath rest. But then they picked right back up late Saturday evening. And then early on Sunday, just as the sun broke across the horizon, these women made their way to the tomb with that spice mix that they had prepared. Those women remained faithful. And because of that faithfulness, they became the first witnesses of the resurrection. While they stood in that tomb, confused by the missing body, two men dazzling in white appear. "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" they ask. "He's not here. He's risen." And they looked at one another uncertainly, until finally they remembered the words that Jesus himself had spoken to them, that he would be crucified and on the third day rise again. And so they rush out of that empty tomb in order to tell the others. These women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them, they become the inaugural bearers of good news. In their exuberance, when they get back to the others, they try to tell them what had happened. And then due to their excitement, they begin talking all over one another about a rolled away stone and two brilliant men. Or maybe they were angels and that empty tomb and the spice mixture that they had brought but no longer needed. And then they looked at one another in the midst of that cacophony, and the tears well up, those tears of joy, and they hug each other saying, it was just like he had always said, he's alive. But the disciples who stayed back in that room, those men hiding out, start raising eyebrows, giving knowing glances to one another. These women didn't have any clue of what they were talking about. And then those guys started first century mansplaining. Luke writes, these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Friends, in the Greek, it's a lot more condescending. These women are delirious. They're a few bricks shy of a full load. They're hysterical. And I imagine one of those men thinks he's doing those women a favor by saying, now you know that Jesus died, and he was placed in that tomb that was all sealed up. So perhaps you're a little overly tired from all of the stress. Why don't you go get some sleep, and when you wake up, you'll see how what you're saying just can't be true. In Schrodinger's hypothetical thought experiment with the cat goes into the box alive. And then once it's closed up, we don't know if the cat is either alive or dead based on the possible release of some poison. However, if the cat went in dead, well, there would be nothing to ponder, right? And so it was with the apostles. Jesus was no longer alive. Clearly, he was dead when he went into the tomb, and there's no way around it. It was the worst of times. It was the worst of times. Full stop. And those delirious women don't have any clue about what they're talking about. But Mary, Joanna, Mary, and the others were having nothing of that. Because they had been there on Friday at the cross long after the men had left. And they were the ones who got out of the house early to take care of Jesus' body that morning. They did what women do everywhere in the midst of a crisis. They remained present. No matter what came their way, they weren't going to be deterred. And now they saw that empty tomb with their own eyes, and no amount of gaslighting was going to convince them otherwise. It was the worst of times. It was the best of times. In her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, writer Rebecca Solnit explores the altruistic communities that emerge in the midst of extreme disasters. Solnit begins by exposing the false belief that people are generally selfish, panicky, or regressively savage during times of disaster. There's little truth to it, she writes. And then she explains that decades of meticulous sociological research on behavior of disasters, from the bombings of World War II to floods and tornadoes, earthquakes and storms across this continent and around the world, have demonstrated this. She then surmises, when all ordinary divides and patterns are shattered, people step up. Not all, but a great preponderance, in order to become their brothers and sisters' keepers, using that biblical language from the story of Cain and Abel. And that, she says, that purposefulness and connectedness bring joy even amid death and chaos and fear and loss. Communities formed in the midst of fear and death leading to joy. It sounds like what happened to those women on that first Easter morning. Many of us come into this Easter morning carrying a lot of uncertainty and despair, fear and pain. We come in much like those apostles holed up back in the upper room. We have seen enough of the real world to know what it's really like. We read the news about Ukraine and Gaza and South Sudan. We watch as people are rounded up in our country and deported without due process. We see those new laws decidedly against members of the trans community. We unadvisedly check the balance on our own retirement accounts. Some of us are dealing with a new diagnosis, or the realization that a relationship is tanking. We're dealing with a troubled teen that we just can't understand. And then we come to this place. And hear once again the story of Jesus' resurrection and the joy of Easter, and we're thinking, yeah, that's crazy talk. It really is the worst of times. There's no getting around it. But those women won't be silenced. They keep at it even after they've been summarily dismissed by the apostles. Jesus is no longer dead. His body wasn't in the tomb. He's alive. By God, he is alive. And they keep on doing it long enough that Peter finally gets up and goes to the tomb himself. And then later that evening, after two others come back from a walk to Emmaus and describing their encounter with the risen Christ, we hear that Peter saw Jesus there too. And on it goes. The reality that death and the grave were vanquished through the power of love. That even in the darkest of times, in the places where we encounter hell, Jesus offers us joy and life and abundance. We just have to believe that the worst of times can indeed become the best of times through that deep love of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus, that one left broken and dead, has indeed been raised to life. And he can bring that same power to our lives if only we trust those women who first encountered him. Alleluia, Christ is risen.